Hey folks, this is Rhykker, and we just got the official patch notes for Diablo 4 patch 1.1.1, which is going live next week, August 8th. In this video, we'll go through the salient points of the patch notes, sum up the major takeaways, and give my thoughts. So class balance adjustments. They want to focus mostly on the Sorcerer and the Barbarian. For the Sorcerer, they're working on improving late game survivability, mostly through the Paragon board. And they're also trying to remove a lot of the kiss curse effects, whereby you are gaining a benefit, but at the cost of something. So the example would be the legendary aspect giving you more Hydra heads, but the Hydras last less amount of time. So they were doing a pass and kind of removing all of these malices while keeping the benefits. And then for the Barbarian, we're seeing some early game improvement. This is great change. Barbarian overall is a strong class, but early game, the 1 to 50, the leveling, Barb is one of the weaker classes. Barb and Druid are the two weaker classes for that early game, so speeding up the flow of combat in the early game by increasing Fury Generation on basic skills. Great improvement. This is feedback that I had put forth from the beta that I was hoping that the game would launch with improvements to Barbarian early game. But they also want to add late game excitement by increasing the power of unique items. Their other focus with this patch is strengthening builds that aren't reaching a high power level and diversifying the use cases for legendary items and other effects that are overly situational. So going through class by class, starting with the Barbarian here. Again, we're seeing a lot of increased Fury Generation across the board. This is really going to make the Barbarian feel better to play, especially at those lower levels. Now, prior to this patch, the top Barbarian builds were Whirlwind and Hammer of the Ancients. Hammer of the Ancients previously was the top Barbarian build, but the last patch nerfed it considerably because there were some bugged interactions that were making it do way more damage than it should have been doing. So now it got brought down. It's not dead, but it was put about on level as Whirlwind. Whirlwind and Hammer of the Ancients aren't really being affected by this patch. We actually are getting a buff to Hammer of the Ancients via an increase to the damage that the Aspect of Ancestral Force is dealing. We're getting like a 15% damage bonus here to Aspect of the Ancestral Force. In general, I don't think it's going to change too much for the Barbarian at the top end, but we are seeing our buffs to some of the underperforming builds that will help elevate them. Nonetheless, Whirlwind and Hoda are still likely to dominate the high end. Whirlwind for more speed content, potentially Hoda for more pushing content. But we're seeing Upheaval rising up in power, Double Swing as well rising up in power. I mean, this is a 25% damage buff to Double Swing. We're also seeing buffs to Bleeds, which is going to help with the Rend build. In particular here, Gushing Wounds, right? Now, overpowered damage by itself falls off late game, but this is just based on overpowering. It's not actually scaling off of overpowered damage. With Gushing Wounds, when you overpower enemies, you create a damage area that deals bleeding damage over time, and we're getting this massive jump from 11% to 70% bleed damage. We're also seeing a number of changes that feels like they're trying to make a Leapquake Barb build viable. So basically a Barbarian that synergizes around leaping and causing earthquakes. I'm unconvinced that this is going to happen, but I look forward to seeing people try to make it work, and I'd be happy to see it become a viable build. Onto Rogue. Not a whole lot going on here because the class is already in a pretty good place to begin with. But we're seeing a change to Forceful Arrow that actually makes it now an inviting generator or basic skill for ranged rogues. Basically right now, Puncture is just what all rogue builds use. And what it comes down to is really applying Vulnerable. Rogues, more than any other class, revolve around vulnerable builds, and their ease with which that they can apply Vulnerable to all enemies. Fundamental Puncture is just a really easy way for pretty much every rogue build to apply Vulnerable to enemies. And the way Forceful Arrow works is that every third cast will make enemies vulnerable. And what primary Forceful Arrow used to do is that it would pierce vulnerable enemies. So you would do 1, 2, 3 hits, the third hit would make one enemy vulnerable, and then you hit that enemy and the arrow pierces that enemy. Whereas now, you're going to do 1, 2, 3 hits, and the third hit is going to pierce and apply vulnerable. This is a huge change, because now every third hit is going to make multiple enemies vulnerable. That's the only thing that I really see changing in the rogue meta moving forward. based on these patch notes. I don't see this making a huge change for rogues overall. It's not a buff to their power, really. They're already in a good place power-wise. They're also in a very good place with regards to the number of viable builds that they have, but what it's allowing for is a little bit more variety within all those builds. Now, they don't all have to use puncture. For the Druid, we're seeing, again, increase to their generators, similar to the Barbarian. Druid was one of the weaker 1 to 50 leveling classes. This is going to help them out. It's also going to alleviate some of the resource issues at the early end game, so just a smoother experience overall for Druids. Not an increase to power overall, but definitely a better experience. We're also seeing a number of changes to pets for the Druid. We're seeing bonuses to the damage that the wolves do, that the ravens do. Is this enough to make a pet druid viable? Probably not, but it would be cool if it did. Druids as well, currently in the meta, are in a pretty good place. They have a number of powerful builds. This largely helps bring up their early game viability as well. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, there were some early leveling pet builds that were pretty good, so this might also be an inadvertent or perhaps an intentional buff to the early game druid. Alright, the big one, Sorcerer. This really was the focus of this whole patch. Sorcerer, and to a lesser extent Barbarian. I was initially very excited to see all the love that the Sorc was getting. Before this patch, the top Sorcerer builds were Blizzard and Ice Shards, both cold builds. In fact, on my top 10 builds list video, if I had 11th place, I probably would have given it to either Ice Shards or Blizzard Sorcerer. So what we're seeing in the patch notes are buffs to Fire and Lightning Sorcerer. So we're getting buffs to the Chain Lightning build, buffs to Fireball, a big buff to Esu's Ferocity passive, which normally was contingent on you killing an enemy, which makes it generally useless against bosses, but now you also get the bonus after hitting a boss with a crit. We get a nice big buff to Combustion. Before this, it was just dealing 2% increased damage. Now it's 20% plus an additional 2% increased damage. So again, very nice buff to fire builds here. Then in the Paragon board, we're seeing a lot of bumps up to the damage reduction that you can get. 10% to 15%, 10% to 15%, 13% to 25%. That is huge right there. 25% damage reduction from one node. 4 to 5%, 4 to 5%, 4 to 5%. All these little nodes are going to add up. They are going to feel meaningful in the end. So this does improve the Sorc's late game viability. Makes them able to survive those higher nightmare dungeons a bit more. That's a problem that sorcerers have currently. They're glass cannons. They cannot stack armor as well as other classes. Armor is a big source of damage reduction. They're very reliant on their cooldowns to keep them alive. Cooldown got nerfed. So already, right out the gate, Sorcs were pretty glass cannon compared to other classes. Then the big nerf from the last major patch hurt them some more. This is bringing back survivability. And even though we're not releasing direct buffs to the top Sorc builds, again, Blizzard and Ice Shards, these changes will increase overall the power level of the Sorcerer. It's not going to blast it up to be the #1 best class, but it could certainly be top 10 build worthy. We'll have to see how a lot of these changes actually play out when the patch goes live, right? So far, this is all theoretical. We're seeing a ton of changes to legendary aspects, again, mostly revolving around fire and lightning. Big buff to the aspect of Engulfing Flames. We're getting that bonus burning damage doubled. Aspect of the Unbroken Tether is giving us a lot more Chain Lightning bounces now. Chain Lightning's a really fun Sorc build. It was just hitting viability. This is going to help it, all these changes altogether, going to help it be even more viable now. But that means we are getting a nerf to the recharging aspect, unfortunately. Used to be able to get 6 mana. That's getting dropped down. The major buff for Blizzard Sorcs is actually that now, while within your own Blizzard and for 3 seconds after leaving it, you take 25% less damage. It used to be only in the Blizzard, so this is actually going to be a very good quality of life change for Blizzard Sorcs pushing Nightmare Dungeons when, you know, standing still under your Blizzard might kill you, so dodging out at least, you got that 3-second buffer to reposition, recast, before you become super squishy again. Alright, onto the Necromancer. Not a whole lot of changes. Necro's already a really strong class, but we're seeing a nice damage buff to Wither. This is a shadow damage. Basically, shadow damage based Necros are getting a nice buff. We are also seeing a rework to the aspect of empowering Reaper. Previously, it was crits with Sever had a chance to spawn this. Now it's just direct damage with Sever, so this increases the usability of this. Overall, Sever build, so Sever Necro, one of the best leveling builds, super fun as well. This is going to really help this combined with the Wither Paragon board change, really going to help the late game viability of Sever. And then we're getting a massive buff to the aspect of Torment. This is when you hit enemies with a bone skill, like Bone Spear. Essence regeneration is increased from 30% to 170%. Again, huge change here. Bone Spear already an amazing build. It could be essence thirsty, but that's one of the trade-offs. This is a change that, I mean, I welcome it as someone who played Bone Spear, but it kind of feels like the rich getting richer. Now we're also seeing buffs to the minion necro. I suppose you can say minion survivability is being increased. I don't think this is going to have a huge impact on pet necro's endgame viability, but this is a nice quality of life change where some of those AoE effects aren't going to kill off your minions nearly as fast. So overall for Necro again, the resource generation can potentially impact the top level ability of the Necro. Overall, not a huge shakeup in the meta apart from perhaps the Shadow builds rising a bit in power, but I don't see them overtaking the top Necro builds. And in summary across all the classes here, as we're getting to gameplay updates, not expecting massive shakeups in the meta, but an improvement in the overall balance, the overall distribution of power between different builds, and even the ability to change perhaps certain staples that are always taken across certain builds within a given class. Now, gameplay updates, monster density in Nightmare Dungeons and in Helltide. We don't know by how much, but if we go back to the campfire chat where they showed an example side by side of before and after, it looks like roughly a 60% increase in density. We'll see when the patch goes live though. Bosses above level 60 will have more health. Hey. Does that include world bosses? So bosses at level 60 and below will remain unchanged, but level 80 bosses, 50% more health. Level 100, 100%, double health. Top players complaining about bosses being too easy, and then we doubled it. I do hope this extends to world bosses, because really, world tier 4, you get to a point where world bosses are just getting deleted in like 15 seconds. Also, Nightmare Dungeon bosses deleted in short order. Alright, some adjustments to bosses and events. Level 35 and higher bosses now have a 100% chance to drop a legendary item. This is an added incentive to actually go for Nightmare Dungeons that have bosses at the end, or actually go for the boss at the end instead of just leave the dungeon before. Treasure Goblins now have an increased legendary item drop chance from level 6 to 14. Guaranteed legendary drop starting at level 15. Nice change. I do feel like, or prior to this, I did feel like it's not always worth it to go after a Treasure Goblin. The amount of time it takes to kill them, particularly because they're just sneaky little buggers that run away. And then, like, you know, oh, I didn't even get a legendary kind of thing. Probably a positive change here. Legion events are now more rewarding and guarantee a legendary item drop starting at level 35. This is a good change as well. I feel like a lot of the top-end players stop bothering with, or don't even bother ever with Legion events. And the issue with Legion events is the time to spectacle. It's how long it takes to get there. And so, you know, these spawn every 30 minutes, and for a lot of top-end players, it's just like, well, the amount of time it takes me to get there is just not worth it for what it's going to give me. Legion events itself, you know, once you're there, excellent source of XP, decent source of items as well. Guaranteeing the legendary makes it a bit more rewarding, though I doubt we're going to see a meta shakeup because of this. Onto some general changes. Stack limit of elixirs has gone to 99. We can now buy an additional stash tab with gold. The leave dungeon cast time went back down to 3 seconds from 5 seconds. The cost of refunding skill and paragon points has been reduced. The reduction starts small at lower levels and hits a maximum of 40% at level 100. So at level 50, you have a 12% reduction. By level 70 at 24%, etc. And then they've also made some improvements on how damage and other effects interact with active barriers. Bonus damage or bonus effects that are applied on hit or when dealing damage will now apply that same effect through barriers. For instance, the exploit Paragon Glyph will now apply vulnerable to enemies that have an active barrier. Previously, if you're doing damage to the barrier and not to the monster's actual health, then they would not be considered getting these effects on them. For the Season 1 Malignant Hearts, we're getting a buff to the Caged Heart of Spellbreaking. It previously gave a buff to your resistances, which is an underperforming defensive stat. Now it's giving you damage reduction instead. And we're getting a buff to temerity, all stats replaced with max life, excellent change, and now the barrier is based on your max life. We have a number of bug fixes apart from that, with one of the standouts actually being fix an issue where the Dark Dance Malignant Power could behave as if the player was damaging themselves, which could apply other effects that occur when the player deals damage. This is a good change, so now you're not hurting yourself with Dark Dance. Similarly, there was an issue with the Barber, where it would absorb damage from all other players, and not just the player with it equipped, so people in groups were like, hey, how come I'm dealing less damage all of a sudden? Oh, because my teammate has a Barber and he's soaking up my damage. So, that's been fixed, great change. So overall, good changes on this patch. Is this a patch to get really excited and hyped about? Probably the most exciting thing is the increase to density. That's going to be the most fun thing to experience now. I'd recommend try out Nightmare Dungeons now, try out Helltide now with the increased density. Is this going to be more fun? For a lot of people, they want to be slaying hordes of demons. And overall, again, classes in a better place, Sorc in a better place. Are we seeing like sexy new builds emerge? Probably not, but hey, hopefully yes. But I turn the question to you folks, what are your thoughts on these patch notes? Sound off in the comments, because that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykker's Raiders for more Diablo content.